Well, Paul Atreides, it's true that times are certainly changing. A Complete Unknown is directed by James Mangold and is the biopic to the legendary musician Bob Dylan. And what did I think of it? Well, let's talk about the categories and give it a score. First off, acting. Timothée Chalamet is the lead role. He plays Bob Dylan and does it really, really well. He's got the mannerisms, he's got the style, he's got kind of everything going on as Bob Dylan. Now, at sometimes, yes, I do see Timothée Chalamet peeking through, only because I've seen him in so many freaking movies recently at this point because he's on such a roll where it's kind of hard not to. That's not a discredit to how he does in his performance in this film. It's just that he's so plastered on everyone's screens that it's kind of just like, oh, there's Timothée Chalamet. He is easily one of the best parts of this film from start to finish, and I really enjoyed his performances. Then you have Ed Norton as Pete Seeger, who is the kind of mentor father figure in this film for Bob Dylan. He plays this role kind of like you would think of like an old folk singer where everyone's talking about how they're all old school, and he's this Uncle Rogers-esque, just really, really great guy. Ed Norton plays him perfectly. Then you have arguably the best performance in the entire film with Ellie Fanning as Sylvie Russo, who is going to be pretty much the main love interest throughout the entire film for Bob Dylan. You feel her love, you feel her pain, you feel her suffering, and you feel her joy. And that's all because Fanning does such a great job at producing these emotions and pulling them out from you. She is kind of the everyday person in this scenario, and you kind of take a trip with her even though she's not on the screen all the time like Timothée Chalamet is. I think they're all great. I could go on for hours and hours and talk about how I felt sucked in, even though I looked at the cast and it was stacked. I truly didn't really see anybody. All I saw was brilliant performances from start to finish, so with that case, I'm just going to give it a full star out of 1 within this category. Visuals. So if you do a biopic, you have a few routes you can take. You can be super creative like Rocket Man. You can kind of be traditional like Bohemian Rhapsody. Or you can find your own path and do it like this. There isn't any crazy montages to prove a point. It's simple and effective, but also very complex with a lot of the camera movement. The framing is beautiful. Everything is beautiful, except there are a couple issues. Issue number 1 is there are way too many lens flares. Now, I do understand since he's on stage and you might catch some of the spotlight, I could say, yeah, like, sure, you'll get a lens flare. But even then, those lens flares kind of linger for a little too long. But there are a lot of times in this film where there's just lens flares randomly. And I'm not talking like they're in a dark room and then a lens flare is produced without any light. I'm just talking about like the mood doesn't ask for a lens flare. To me, like a lens flare is a certain moment that you kind of need for it. It adds a certain level of pizzazz, I guess. But this film just kind of does it and it's distracting. Then the editing is super choppy at times. When they have beautiful shots that they're following Bob, they'll sometimes just cut a bunch of times and then go back to that beautiful shot. And I go, why'd you do that? There was no point in cutting around whatever you had. There was also a few mistakes here and there. And there was also one extra in the background that was extremely distracting. Overall, I think it lended itself really well for the most part, but its mistakes holds it back from being truly effective. So I'm only going to give it a half a star out of 1 within this category. Audio. So, of course, a movie about one of the greatest musicians of all time has to have great music, right? Well, it does. Now, of course, the score isn't anything to write home about. There isn't anything great about the score whatsoever. Only the fact that Bob Dylan's music is laid throughout the film, as well as other musicians' music is perfectly placed around it. I assume Timothée Chalamet sung the music, played the music. I assume that. Now, I feel like, of course, afterwards they helped out with a bit of it, trying to make it seem seamless and a little more palatable in terms of just a cleaner sound and not giving you like live performance vibes essentially. But again, my assumption, if it's him, it's brilliant. If it's not, I don't care. It wasn't distracting. Then you have Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez. Then you have Edward Norton as Pete Seeger and Boyd Holbrook as Johnny Cash. And again, if they're all the ones singing these roles, it's amazing. They sound absolutely phenomenal. And if they're also playing the music at the same time, kudos to them. Brilliant work. But like I said with the visuals, there is a distracting part in this film that cannot be unnoticed by people who, like me, like to nitpick at times. The amount of ADR in this film, it's ridiculous. It happens constantly. When characters' backs are turned or when they're faced a certain way, they're speaking, their mouths aren't moving. Or they're doing an action and you don't hear this or that. It gets very distracting if you're kind of noticing it. So with all that being said, I'm only going to give it a half a star out of 1 within this category. Story. So of course, to get it out the way, a biopic is definitely hard to judge. It's kind of like documentaries are hard to judge because it's real life stuff. Of course, there are going to be creative liberties throughout the entire film that are going to allow to have moments that are a little more dramatized than normal. But the film does have a lot of issues when it comes to pacing. This film feels like it moves at a nice pace and then they hit a concert and then it slows down. They hit a nice pace, they slow down. It's kind of like how Mufasa was with the flash forward scenes. And yeah, I enjoyed the concert stuff, but the concert stuff took up a lot of runtime. And of course, the fact that it does kind of play a little slower, there aren't no montages, I do kind of like that as well. It's a double-edged sword here. I really like it, but I also really hate it because it also kind of shows off of how Bob Dylan was as this guy who's just kind of going with it and doing his own thing his own way. But I think the biggest thing is I don't think that it deserved to be over 2 hours. I think it could have been 2 hours or 2 hours and 5 minutes, maybe. It could have easily shaved around 15 to 20 minutes of story time. And even though that it was really nice to know a little bit more about Bob Dylan and where he came from, it also left a lot of questions to be answered. And yeah, biopics, you want more answers, and this film didn't really give too much of it. It's a good biopic, don't get me wrong. It's easily one of my favorites. But again, biopics are not typically really dug in deep into these artists' minds. So with all that being said, I'm just going to give it a half a star out of 1 within this category. Enjoyment. Well, it's a grounded biopic about a very grounded man with a very artistic mind. This film shows Bob Dylan as Bob Dylan. They show him as his own self in the way that, you know, he saw the world and how others saw him. The frustration, the love, the brilliance, all of it littered throughout the film. But some lens flares and some ADR and some very long concert scenes takes away from all brilliant performances from everyone on board. This was a film where, yeah, I was kind of looking at my phone and wondering when this was going to end. This also was a most anticipated film of the year for me. And unfortunately, it doesn't follow suit and it doesn't match my expectations, especially with James Mangold. James Mangold is like a bipolar director. He can put out great stuff like Logan, Ford versus Ferrari, but then also do the Indiana Jones new movie and then the Wolverine. Like, he has such a strange docket of films that can be quite confusing. Overall, I kind of enjoyed it, but I just didn't love it. It's not something I'm dying to rewatch. So with all that being said, I'm just going to give it a half a star out of 1 within this category. So if you're keeping track at home, that means A Complete Unknown gets 3 out of 5 stars. I think the film is mediocre.